I set out to build the lightest sleep system I possibly could this year while still maintaining a relative degree of safety and a relative degree of comfort. A couple notes I want to make on today's video. This is not for the rookies in the house. If you're newer to backcountry hunting, I do not recommend being too aggressive with your system. Build in more safety, take fewer risks. I want to get that out of the way right now. However, I do think with a certain amount of experience and a certain amount of forethought, you can create systems that will enable you to go lighter than you previously thought while still maintaining an acceptable degree of risk. Secondly, this is less of a review than it is a report on a series of tests that I did. You could replace all of the gear in this video with other similar gear, and theoretically, you should get the exact same results. Now, I used the word integrated before, and I want to dive into that a little bit before we get into the video. I got in a bit of an online argument the other day because I did this Q&A. Somebody asked what sleeping bag I would recommend for a given system, and I gave my response. And then somebody felt the need to send me a DM and kind of disagree with me, which is totally fine. But he went so far as to say that I was being reckless by advising that to people. And I think there is this kind of old school philosophy in backcountry hunting that like more is always safer, and that somehow by having more, you're going to be better off. And I don't want to throw guides under the bus here, but the people who tend to be recommending this strategy the most often, and the ones that seem to send me messages, tend to be horseback guides. And so I want to be very clear. There is a difference in the amount of gear that a guy can take who's going to, for example, be solo hunting out of his backpack for 10 or 12 days compared to the guy who's going to have not only access to horseback, but access to cabins quite frequently, access to an entire camp of people who are there to support him if he runs out of something or needs help in some way. And so a lot of times the solo backcountry hunter doesn't have the luxury that these other individuals who have built-in support systems do. I'm not taking anything away from those guys. Those are badass mofos. There's no doubt about it. But I think the default to just always bring heavier, safer gear actually creates more risk for the solo guy or for the pair of guys that are going in and trying to stay as light as possible. Because if you can shave a couple pounds off your system, you're going to save calories, you're going to be able to cover ground quicker. If something does go terribly wrong, you're going to be able to get out faster. When you finally do put something on the ground, you're going to be able to get out in fewer trips. And so I do think there is a very, strong purpose to having a conversation about what's the lightest we can get while still retaining an acceptable degree of safety. So with that in mind, when this guy got pissed off that I recommended a certain bag, he didn't ask me about the rest of the system. Like, just because I'm taking a certain bag, you don't know what I have for a shelter, you don't know what I have for puffy gear, you don't know what I have for the rest of my apparel or my heating system. Like, all these things needed to be looked at in concert, in that you can take on risk in one area if you mediate that risk in another. For example, if you were going to the Pacific Northwest, I don't mind you taking down puffy layers if you have a synthetic bag, or vice versa. So you can rely on one element of your system and take risk in another element of your system. You could take a lighter bag if you had heavier puffy layers. If you were willing to take a hot tent, you could have down in your sleep system and your puffy system, because you're going to be able to use your hot tent system to dry that out at night. Often, these questions are far more complicated than just like a single piece of gear can answer. So with all that being said, my goal was to build an integrated sleep system that would take into account my pad, my apparel, my shelter, and my quilt, and utilizing all of those elements at once, how could I get that down to the lowest overall weight? Because I do think there's this tendency that people build an apparel system for a given environment, and then simultaneously they build a sleep system for the same environment. And then they're carrying a bag that's probably 10 or 15 degrees overbuilt, and their puffy layers just sit beside them every night. And I think instead, if you looked at these as an integrated system between your apparel and your sleep system, you can shave a pound or two off of the system as a whole and still have the same kind of temperature range for comfort and survival. Now, before I get into the actual gear that I used on this test, I need to share with you a couple quick updates. First, Black Friday deals. Let's do it. If you go right now to forgedinthebackcountry.com, all apparel is 30% off until December 2nd with the code BF24, and all orders over $150 still qualify for free shipping. In addition to that, I'm going to offer a Black Friday deal on my guided BC spring bear hunts. These hunts are any weapon, spot and stalk through a variety of terrain, from cut blocks to alpine to deactivated roads. You fly into Vancouver, 3 or 4 hour drive to camp, 6-day hunts. We can do 1-on-1, we can do 2-on-1, and I'm offering up to 20% discount on these hunts. But they have to be booked in December, and they have to be for the 2025 spring season, which runs from May 1st to June 15th. So if you're interested in getting in on one of those deals, shoot me an email, jay@mindfulhunter.com, and I'll get you all the details and pricing. Final note, there are 3 weeks left to enter the Prime RVX34 giveaway. Anyone who joins Mindful Reviews between now and December 2nd gets automatically entered to win. So head on over, mindful-reviews.com, pick one of the subscription plans, and be automatically entered to win a Prime RVX34 compound bow between now and December 15th. So let's dig into the system that I used this year for this particular testing, because the goal was, what's the lightest quilt I can get away with? So I got an Enlightened equipment synthetic quilt, the Enigma, which has the sewn foot box. Is my favorite quilt from them. I got the long wide variant. I upgraded the shell to 20D. And the reason I do that is that if you need to, you can use it outside. So if you want to sit in it while you're glassing, it's a little bit more robust than the 10D shell. Upgraded the internal liner from 7D to 10D. Also wanted just a little bit more protection there. And so overall, that quilt came in at 12.3 ounces or 349 grams and cost $250 USD. Now, the confusing part about that is that when I built the same quilt on their system using down, it came out to the same weight. Theoretically, in order to achieve the same comfort rating or the same temperature rating, a synthetic quilt tends to be heavier than a down quilt. So I was originally going to say, if you wanted to do this exact exercise and save a couple more ounces, go to the down quilt, but the down quilt comes out at 12 ounces as well. So I'm not sure about that. I want to follow up with Enlightened Equipment and see what they say. For a sleeping pad, I had the Big Agnes Q-Core SLX. Now that's got an R value of 3.2. So any similarly rated R value of 3-ish sleeping pad should do the same thing that this pad did. Now that weighs 24 ounces or 680 grams. And I will admit, that's a slightly heavier pad. You could shave 6 or 7 ounces off that, especially if you went with something like a NeoWear X-Lite. I'm 6'1", 240 pounds. I have tried to use the thinner sleeping pads and it always results in garbage sleep. So I've just kind of given in to the fact that I am going to have a 20 to 24 ounce sleeping pad in order to get the quality of sleep that I'm looking for. Now, for apparel, this is what I slept in during the tests. Boxer briefs from Lululemon, Sitka Ascent pants, and Darn Tough socks. So that is very little coverage on the bottom half. For anybody who's worn those Sitka Ascent pants, they're basically paper thin, and I had no long johns and I was wearing no puffy pants. So there's definitely the ability to add even more protection to this system. Up top, I had a KUIU Tiburon hybrid base layer, which is paper thin. Then the Sitka Ambient hoodie. Over top of that, the Stone Glacier Grumman puffy. And then a Sitka Jetstream beanie on my head. I will say here, I strongly recommend you to take time and understand the attachment system of a quilt. On the Enigma, there's 3 attachment points, 2 elastic straps, and then a button that goes around your neck. And if you do all of those up properly and securely, the amount of heat retention in that quilt just goes up like tenfold compared to just leaving it open. And so I always find it frustrating when people tell me, "Yeah, I tried running a quilt, but it didn't really work with me. I was really cold." And then I start digging into how they had it attached to their pad, and it's just a mess. So if you're going to push the boundaries with a quilt, remember to take it seriously and understand how to attach and close that system properly. Okay, test conditions. Now, I did multiple nights truck camping before the actual in the field testing, just to make sure I wasn't getting in over my head. So I almost call those like testing light. I don't really take those into account because you're in the canopy, you've got the truck as backup. But for the actual testing, okay, so the first 2 nights on my elk hunt in Wyoming, I slept without a shelter. If you want to know why I slept without a shelter, go listen to this podcast right here. You will understand what an absolute nightmare that hunt was and why there was missing mules and horses and all kinds of stuff that resulted in us sleeping without a shelter for the first 2 nights. On both nights, it dropped below 0 degrees Celsius. I know this because I woke up and the water in my Nalgene was frozen. Now, it wasn't a brick, but it was frozen across, it gets that thin layer where the lid screws on. So my guess is it got down to a lowest of maybe minus 2 degrees Celsius or 25 degrees Fahrenheit each night. Without the shelter, I was able to get through the night with the 50-degree quilt, the Big Agnes Q-Core SLX, and all the layers I described previously. I was not comfortable. However, I was able to get an acceptably restful sleep. I would say with these particular layers and those particular conditions, that was about the limit of this system. Maybe for pure survival, I could have pushed it another 2 or 3 degrees. I mean, you're not going to die, but you also need to sleep. Like just staying wrapped up all night. If you're not getting any sleep, you're not going to hunt well the next day. If you're not going to hunt well the next day, your system doesn't work. So let's say that I couldn't have gone a couple more degrees and survived. Let's say I could have gone maybe 2 to 3 more degrees and still gotten enough rest to hunt effectively the next day. So minus 2 degrees, let's say minus 5 degrees Celsius or 20 degrees Fahrenheit would be the absolute limit of what I'd be willing to take on this hunt. And remember, I had no shelter and it didn't rain. Obviously, you can't sleep without a shelter if it's going to rain. So that kind of throws all the results out the window, or snow. But with no precipitation, that's as far as I would be willing to take this system. Remember, this is expert level stuff. I do not recommend people who don't have extensive backcountry hunting or camping experience running things this close to the line. And to say one more time, it was not comfortable, but it was tolerable. Now, the next 2 nights after that, temperature stayed exactly the same, but I slept in a teepee. I would say having the shelter around you, even without a heat source inside the shelter, adds a minimum of 5 degrees to your sleep system. And I think it could add as much as 10 degrees to your sleep system. Just warming that air up in there. When the wind moves across your body without a shelter, it's just basically ripping the heat right away from you. So to be able to be inside that shelter and keep that warm air around your body, those next 2 nights, I slept like a baby. Still had water freeze outside of the shelter. It was still going below 0 degrees Celsius or 25 degrees Fahrenheit every night, but slept phenomenally well. So I would almost say with a shelter, you might even be able to go a couple degrees colder. But again, let's use that -5 degrees Celsius or 20 degrees Fahrenheit as the limit of what I would take this system that was built around a 50 degree Fahrenheit quilt or a 10 degree Celsius quilt. So I was able to push the system, and those are kind of survival ratings. Those are not comfort ratings that Enlightened equipment uses. And I will be the first to admit, Enlightened equipment tends to use kind of overly liberal temperature ratings. I think for people who've done back-to-back testing, for example, a Katabatic quilt with the same temperature rating will be more comfortable than an Enlightened equipment. But let's just say, just by integrating my apparel and my puffy layers, I was able to squeeze an extra 15 degrees out of my quilt. So I could have been carrying a quilt that might have been a half a pound to a pound heavier in order to be running a quilt that would have got me to the same comfort level without using my apparel and puffy layers. But I saved that weight by integrating my apparel and puffy layers. The last note I'm going to make on sleeping in the apparel, I always sleep in my clothes. I don't care if it's the summertime. I don't care if it's warm. The reason I like sleeping in my clothes is eliminating the psychological barrier of getting up in the morning. I don't like the idea of waking up, it's cold outside my quilt, it's warm inside the quilt, and I fight this like 10-minute psychological battle trying to force myself to get out of the quilt. If I sleep in my clothes, as soon as my alarm goes off in the morning, quilt gets open, I hop out, I got the stove fired up, and I'm making coffee. Like I'm getting ready to go immediately. And so that's a little hack. So that's what actually led me to this whole train of thought, is that I always slept in my clothes. And I was starting to bring quilts that were rated for the actual temperatures I was in. And I'm like, I'm too warm. Like I'm over quilted here. There's room to save weight while still maintaining an acceptable degree of risk. And so let's just go over that one more time. Like if you're going to be pushing the limits with these integrated systems, like thinking to yourself, how can I mediate risk over here so that I can take on more risk over here? I almost want you to think, what is my overall risk rating for this hunt? What are all the elements that are going to introduce some degree of danger into this hunt? And then how am I mediating that risk across all the levels of my kit, like the different pieces of gear that I'm bringing? And if some of them are a bit more aggressive and are assuming more risk, make sure that you have other ones that are a little bit more conservative that are creating a higher degree of safety in your system. There you have it, folks. Take it all with a grain of salt. Go out, do your own testing. If you completely disagree with what I did, or you think it was idiotic, or maybe you've got your own results from your own testing, start the conversation down in the comments section below. I would love to get feedback from you guys and see what other areas these integrated systems are providing an opportunity for you to shave some weight. Please do me a favor and hit the like and subscribe button. It really helps boost the content up in the algorithm. And as always, thank you for tuning in.